Welcome to Into the Arms of Morpheus podcast, a quiet story from history. Tonight, the island at the edge of everything. Close your eyes. There is an island in the South Pacific Ocean. It sits in a stretch of water so remote that most maps do not bother to name the sea around it. There are no shipping lanes nearby. No reason for a ship to pass this way unless it is specifically coming here, which almost none ever do. The nearest inhabited land is hundreds of miles away in every direction. The island itself is small. You could walk across it in a few hours. It has a mountain at its center, covered in dense subtropical forest. The forest runs from the summit down to the shoreline, where the land meets the sea in rocky cliffs and small pebbled beaches. On those beaches, the sea comes in steadily, wave after wave, the same way it has been coming in since long before there was anyone to hear it. No one lives here now. For most of its existence, no one has lived here at all. Ships have occasionally stopped over the centuries to take on fresh water, to hunt the goats that earlier visitors left behind. But no one has stayed. The island has belonged, for most of its history, entirely to itself. It is called Masa Tierra. In a later century, it will be renamed Robinson Crusoe Island, after the fictional castaway whose story was inspired in part by the man who lived here. But that name comes later. Tonight, it is simply the island, remote and quiet, and entirely itself. But for a period of a little over 4 years, in the early 1700s, one man was here alone. His name was Alexander Selkirk, and this is what his days were like. He had asked to be left here. This is the part of the story that most people do not know. He was not shipwrecked. He was not the victim of a mutiny or a storm or any dramatic nautical event. He was a sailing master on a privateering voyage, a man of some experience and some standing on his ship, and he had come to believe that the vessel was not seaworthy. He had argued this with the captain. The argument had been heated and had gone badly for Selkirk, who was not a man who expressed disagreement quietly. In the end, pressed to a decision, he said he would rather be put ashore on this island than continue on a ship he did not trust. He likely meant it as a statement of the strength of his conviction. He may have expected the captain to reconsider. The captain did not reconsider. They put him ashore with what they could spare: a musket and shot and powder, a knife, a hatchet, some basic tools, a cooking pot, his Bible and a few other books, a pound of tobacco, a blanket, the minimum a person might need to survive in a place with food and fresh water and shelter material available. The ship's boat rowed him into the beach. The sailors unloaded his things. They pushed off and rowed back to the ship. He stood on the beach and watched the ship make sail. He had been entirely certain about his decision right up until the moment the ship began to move. And then something changed. The ship grew smaller. The figures on the deck became indistinct. The sounds of the ship, the creak of the rigging, the voices, faded and disappeared. And he was standing on a beach, on an island in the middle of the South Pacific, with everything he owned in a pile beside him. And the ship was going, and he was staying. And the distinction between those two things was becoming very clear. He ran into the water after it. It did not stop. He stood in the shallows and watched until the ship was gone over the horizon. Then he was alone. The first months were very hard. Not because of any immediate physical threat. The island was, in material terms, generous. The goats that earlier visitors had left were numerous and not especially wary, and could be hunted without great difficulty. The shallows held fish. The forest produced wild turnips and a kind of pepper plant, and various edible things that he gradually identified through experimentation and observation. Fresh water ran from the mountain in small streams. He was not going to starve. He was not going to die of thirst. The hardship was of a different kind entirely. The silence, where other people should have been. He would speak aloud sometimes, just to hear a human voice, even if it was only his own. He would have conversations with himself, answering his own questions, maintaining the form of dialogue even without a participant. He would sing to himself, hymns mostly that he half remembered from childhood, the words becoming less certain over time as there was no one to correct them or to remind him of the verses he had forgotten. The singing was not for pleasure. It was to fill the silence, which had a quality he had never encountered before, and which pressed on him in a way that was difficult to describe. At night, the sounds of the island filled the dark. The wind moving through the forest canopy, which produced a continuous, low sound like distant water. The sea on the shore, regular and rhythmic, the waves arriving and receding without pause. The calls of seabirds settling in the trees, and the rustling of things in the undergrowth that he gradually learned to identify and eventually stopped noticing. He learned, very slowly, to hear all of this as a kind of company. Not human company, not what he wanted, but a presence around him that was alive and continuous, a world doing its own things without regard to him. The forest moved at night. The seabirds called and settled. The sea kept its rhythm, regardless of whether he was listening. He began to pay attention in a way he never had before. He learned which bird made which call and at what time of day. He learned the sound the forest made before rain. He learned to read the sea's different rhythms, the sound of calm water, the sound of a swell building offshore. He was learning the island the way you learn a language, by immersion, by necessity, by paying attention until the patterns became clear. It took a long time. After a while, he built 2 huts, one for sleeping, one for cooking and working. He built them from the materials the island provided, wood from the forest, cut and shaped with his hatchet, the gaps filled with whatever would hold. He lined the walls and the floors with the skins of goats he had killed and cured, which kept the damp out and softened the interior, made it something more than just a shelter. The huts were not comfortable by any ordinary standard, but they were his, and they were weatherproof, and they were familiar, which is its own kind of comfort. He made a routine. This became the most important thing he did. The routine was not a response to any practical necessity. The days would have passed without it. But without it, time became formless and featureless and very difficult to inhabit. Without it, the day was just an undifferentiated stretch of alone, with no beginning and no end, and nothing to distinguish one part from another. In the mornings, before eating, he would walk to a high point on the island where he could see the horizon in every direction. He would stand there for a while and look at the sea. Not hoping exactly. He had learned to be careful about hope, which cost something when it was disappointed. Just looking, taking account of what was there, which was ocean in every direction and no sail anywhere on it. Then he would return to the huts and eat. Then work, whatever the day required, maintaining his tools and his huts, which needed constant attention in the damp climate. Hunting, fishing, preparing and preserving food. The island demanded a great deal of practical work to live on comfortably, and he did it. Then the afternoon, moving toward evening. Then the last light going from the sky. Then the sounds of the island at night, and sleep. Day after day, in the same order. The routine becoming so thoroughly ingrained that they barely thought about it. It was simply how days were structured. It was simply what he did. The routine became its own kind of company too. The cats came first. There were wild cats on the island, descendants of animals left by passing ships over the years, gone feral over the generations, living in the forest and the rocky places along the shore. They were not domestic cats in any ordinary sense. They were wary and self-sufficient, and had no particular reason to approach a human being. He began putting food out for them, small pieces of whatever he had cooked. He did this without any specific plan, just because the presence of cats near the huts was better than no presence at all. They came cautiously at first, eating what he left and retreating immediately. Then a little less cautiously. Then willing to eat while he was nearby, watching him sideways with the alertness of a creature that is not yet sure what to make of something. Over weeks and months, they became tame. Not domesticated in the way a cat that has known human beings from kittenhood is domestic. They never entirely lost the edge of the wild, but tame enough to come when he made certain sounds, tame enough to sleep near him at night, curled in the warmth near the entrance of the sleeping hut, their breathing audible in the dark. This was something. Not the warmth of human company, not what he had left behind, but a presence that breathed and moved and had its own requirements and its own habits, which filled a part of the silence that had been most difficult to bear. Later, young goats. He began raising them from kids, keeping them near the huts rather than hunting them, and they grew up without fear of him, and would follow him along the shore in the evenings with the mild curiosity of animals that have no reason to be afraid of anything. He had, by this point, a small community around him. Cats sleeping near the fire, goats moving in the grass outside, the sound of them breathing and feeding and going about their lives. It was not what he had had before, but it was not nothing. The cats curled near him at night. He could feel their warmth and hear their breathing. The goats grazed near the huts in the early morning, raising their heads occasionally to look at him with the mild interest of animals that have grown up without fear. In the evenings they followed him along the shore, not because he fed them, but simply because he was familiar, and the direction he walked was no worse than any other direction. He had made a community out of what was available, small, wordless, entirely non-human, but his. He learned the island thoroughly. Every path through the forest, including the ones he made himself, by walking the same routes repeatedly until the undergrowth gave way and the ground became worn. Every place where fresh water ran down from the mountain, the main streams that ran year-round, and the smaller seasonal trickles that appeared after rain and dried out in dry spells. Every part of the shore where fish could be caught in different seasons, and what the fish were, and what they required. Every vantage point from which the horizon could be seen. He knew the island the way you know a room you have lived in for many years, not by thinking about it, by having lived in it long enough that the knowledge was in the body rather than the mind, automatic, available without retrieval, present before it was asked for. He moved through the island in the dark as well as in daylight, his feet knowing the paths, his hands knowing the trees, the whole geography of it held in him completely. He ran. This is one of the details that the people who eventually found him remarked on. His extraordinary physical condition after 4 years alone. He ran because he needed to move his body, and because the island gave him terrain that required real effort to cross, and because over time, the running became something more than exercise. He chased the goats across the hillsides, not only to catch them, but for the running itself. The particular quality of moving fast through difficult terrain on ground he knew completely. body and the landscape working together in a way that required total attention and produced, in that total attention, something like peace. He had been changed by the island. This was clear to the people who eventually found him, and to him when he reflected on it. He was quieter, more observant, more comfortable with silence than any person he had known before his time here would have believed possible for him specifically. The man who arrived on the beach, the argumentative sailing master, the man who had fought with his captain and demanded to be put ashore rather than continue on a ship he mistrusted, was not quite the man who was still here 4 years later. The island had taken something out of him and put something else back. Slower, more patient, more attentive to what was actually present rather than what was imagined or desired or feared. More suited to this particular small piece of the world than he had been suited to anything before it. Time moved differently on the island. Without other people to measure himself against, without the structures that other people create around time, appointments, obligations, the shared agreement that Tuesday follows Monday and December follows November. Time lost the shape it had always had. It became something else, something wider and less defined. A day was still a day. The sun rose and crossed the sky and set. The light changed through its cycle, the mornings cool and the afternoons warm and the evenings long in summer. But the days did not accumulate into weeks the way they do when you are living with other people, in a world where weeks are named and marked, and the events that happen in them can be placed in a sequence that other people share and can confirm. Here there were just days, one following another in a long, continuous present. The past becoming harder to locate precisely as it receded. The future, not something he spent much time thinking about, because the future was the same as the present. The island, the huts, the routine, the sea. He tried to keep count at first. He cut marks in a piece of wood, one for each day. He kept this up for some time, but gradually the counting mattered less. The number of days he had been on the island did not change anything about the day he was in. It did not make it easier or harder. It was just a number, accumulating, without any particular meaning. After a while he stopped marking. What mattered was this morning, this afternoon, the quality of the light and the water this evening, the routine that gave each day its shape, the cats near the fire, the goats moving in the dusk. The present, which had always before been a thin slice between a past that was already gone and a future that had not yet arrived, became very wide, became, in fact, almost everything. He read his Bible in the evenings. He had always had some relationship with religion, vague, habitual, not deeply examined. On the island, with nothing else to read, he He read carefully and slowly, the way you read when there is no hurry and no distraction, and the words are the only thing in the room. Some passages he knew from childhood. Others came to him as though for the first time. He said later that he had been happier on the island than he had ever been before, or would be again. People were surprised to hear this. They expected him to speak of suffering and longing, and the desperate desire to be rescued. He spoke of those things too, but he also spoke of something else, a quality of life on the island that he had not found anywhere before and would not find afterward. A simplicity, a completeness, a sense that everything required was present and nothing was missing that actually mattered. It surprised him too when he examined it honestly, but it was true. When the rescue ship came, he had been on the island for more than 4 years. He had grown unused to speaking. The sailors who came ashore found a man in goatskin clothes who was difficult to understand at first, not because of any injury, but simply because language had fallen away from him through disuse. He had had no one to speak to for so long that the machinery of speech had become slow and uncertain, like a tool that has not been used and needs to be worked before it runs smoothly again. He relearned quickly. Within weeks on the ship, he was speaking as he had before, the language coming back in full with the return of people to speak it to. He returned to the world he had left. He went back to sea. He sailed other voyages on other ships. He was, by all accounts, a capable and experienced man, well regarded by those who sailed with him. But something was different. He was quieter than he had been, more patient, less given to the arguments and confrontations that had defined him before the island, as though something in him had settled during those 4 years. Some agitation had burned itself out, and what remained was calmer and more contained, as though a part of him had stayed on the island. Standing on the high point in the morning, looking out at the sea, the island is still there, uninhabited as it has been for most of its existence. The forest still covers the mountain. The sea still comes in on the same small beaches. The goats still move through the same terrain he learned so thoroughly that it became, for 4 years, the entire world. The present is very wide tonight. The sea is coming in the same way it always has. The cats are sleeping in the warm dark. The goats are moving slowly through the grass. Rest now, and drift slowly into the arms of Morpheus.